Smugglers were a staple of the Star Wars galaxy's underworld since the invention of the hyperdrive, and they've become quite iconic in Star Wars media. The likes of Han Solo, Dash Rendar, Hilo Viz, and Talon Card have made smuggler characters a staple of Star Wars stories of every era, in which they usually play the role of the scoundrel with a heart of gold. But how did smuggling actually work in the Star Wars universe? In this video, we'll be answering that question, as well as taking a look at the history of smuggling, the challenges smugglers had to avoid, and some of the tricks of the trade.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Smuggling was an ancient profession, one that was so common that local authorities in many parts of the galaxy often turned a blind eye to it. Smugglers, or free traders as many preferred to call themselves, secretly transported goods or people across the galaxy, getting around laws, blockades, and/or active battle lines in the process. Smuggling was the backbone of the galactic black market, making goods or transportation available where they otherwise not be, for good or ill. Though they were often stereotyped as being Corellian due to the sheer number of Corellian smugglers in the galaxy, smugglers came from all walks of life, and they operated in a variety of different ways. Smugglers were typically freelancers, operating either on their own or as part of small crews. Independent smugglers typically flew light freighters, a common class of starship that was large enough to carry significant amounts of cargo, but still small enough to be considered a personal vessel. As typified by the Millennium Falcon, the Ebon Hawk, and the Outrider, smugglers' light freighters were usually heavily modified, equipped with faster hyperdrives, secret compartments, and powerful weaponry. These ships were so frequently used by smugglers that many classes of light freighter seemed more or less designed to be converted into smuggling ships. Of course, not all smugglers were freelance, and there were a number of smuggling rings in the galaxy, some large and some small. Some smuggling rings operated independently, while others were part of larger criminal organizations like the Hutt Cartel or Black Sun. Even independent smugglers often did work for crime lords, smuggling illegal goods from production sites to cartel holdings. With that said, while all smugglers were technically part of the criminal underworld, some were entirely unaffiliated with organized crime, and some even had noble intentions. Smugglers were around throughout the entire history of the Republic, although they usually stayed in the background of galactic events. But there were exceptions to this rule, one of the most notable of which came during the Great Galactic War between the Republic and the true Sith Empire. During the later years of the war, Sith-aligned Mandalorians established a blockade of the Hydian Way, choking off the Republic's main supply line to its rimward holdings. This caused the collapse of Republic forces on the rim and massive supply shortages in the core, and it nearly forced the Republic to surrender to the Sith. But a fleet of smugglers, rallied by the enterprising smuggling legend Hilo Viz, made a move to run the Mandalorian blockade, knowing that the Republic would reward them well for their efforts. Viz and her allies amassed an enormous supply of goods from the rim, loaded them onto bulk freighters, and then used them as a diversion while the smuggler fleet's light freighters carried out a full frontal assault on the Mandalorian blockade. With support from the Republic, the Mandalorian blockade was broken, and Hilo Viz and her smuggler fleet changed the course of history. By the final years of the Republic, smuggling was pretty entrenched in galactic society. It thrived in the regions beyond the Republic's borders, where smugglers were the main suppliers of vital imports to many Outer Rim worlds, and where the Hutts and other criminal cartels were at their strongest. But smugglers also operated all throughout Republic space, helping their customers dodge taxes, regulations, and Trade Federation monopolies. Smuggling was so well established by this time that smugglers had even established their own retirement colony, Kiorin, an Outer Rim planet where smugglers could become fixers for younger smugglers, allowing them to semi-retire without getting out of the game. It was during the time of the Empire, however, that smuggling reached its height. During the Dark Times, the Empire dramatically changed the way galactic trade worked. The mighty trade guilds of the Republic, most of which had supported the CIS during the Clone Wars, were dissolved, and the Empire began to establish stricter regulations on galactic trade. merchant fleets were nationalized, weapons and other formerly common goods came under much stricter control, and the empire imposed high taxes on many controlled substances. In this environment, the demand for smuggling rose considerably. Criminal outfits and remote planets alike began to depend on smugglers to bring in all sorts of goods, especially people living on planets far from the major trade routes. People fleeing imperial oppression often relied on smugglers to escape the long arm of the imperial military, and planets that were blockaded or otherwise treated unfairly by the empire counted on smugglers to get them food shipments and other essentials. Of course, the imperial era brought greater danger for smugglers as well as greater opportunity. The imperial navy regularly interdicted smuggler ships, and smugglers that were caught weren't treated well by the imperial penal system. The rise of the Rebel Alliance and the start of the Galactic Civil War caused smugglers to rise to even greater prominence. A small army of them formed the backbone of the rebellion's support infrastructure, keeping rebel cells supplied with weapons, ammunition, and essential supplies. Smugglers like Han Solo and Dash Rendar provided vital services to the Alliance, for which they were recognized as heroes after the rise of the New Republic. Even after the New Republic emerged victorious from the Galactic Civil War, smugglers continued to thrive as the turmoil of the subsequent decades brought new challenges and new opportunities. There were many different kinds of contraband that smugglers spread across the galaxy, from consumer goods to people. Many smugglers operated in the grey market more than the black market, trafficking in legal goods or providing legitimate transportation services. These smugglers were usually concerned primarily with avoiding regulations of various sorts. Other smugglers covertly provided supplies and equipment to freedom fighters, ran blockades to get essential supplies to those who needed them, or helped people flee government persecution. Smuggling was always illegal, but it wasn't always immoral, and a number of smugglers made a positive difference in the galaxy. Take, for instance, Jolee Bindo. During his time as a Jedi Padawan, before he won renown in the Great Sith War and as a companion of the redeemed Revan, Jolee ran a smuggling operation in the Yukatis system. At the time, the King of Yukatis had put the system under a strict blockade, with the explicit goal of keeping his own people starving and poor, making them easier to control. The Republic and Jedi Order attempted to negotiate an end to this cruelty, but while they were busy getting nowhere, Jolee Bindo decided to take more direct action. He established a full-blown smuggling operation to get food, medicine, and other essentials to the people of Yukatis, running these vital supplies through the Yukatis system blockade to do so. In this case, smuggling saved countless lives, and most people would consider Jolee a hero for it, in spite of the laws broken along the way.
Well, we didn't buy all the equipment per se. Some were happy to donate goods. Some we just knew had more than they could use. Stole is such a harsh word. They would have donated those goods readily enough if they were compassionate. I considered it a tax on the greedy.
This was far from the only instance of smugglers providing humanitarian aid too. Other smugglers helped those in need not by smuggling cargo, but by smuggling people. Smugglers often helped refugees, rebels, and other oppressed people flee planets where their lives were in danger, providing them with more secrecy and discretion than legal methods of transportation could offer. Of course, such smugglers also sometimes helped criminals escape local law enforcement, as many of them had a policy of not asking their clients any questions about their circumstances. Other grey market type smugglers trafficked in goods that were subjected to high taxes or tariffs, whether by the galactic government or local authorities, getting them to their clients for cheap. A lot of legitimate spaces did this type of smuggling on the side, and it was usually tolerated in many systems, particularly out on the rim. Chuck roots, a flavorful plant that could be made into liquor or snuff, and which was subjected to high import taxes, was a popular example of a fairly mundane variety of contraband. But the most notorious smugglers instead trafficked in illegal goods, often in collaboration with criminal outfits. The same methods used by smugglers to sneak refugees off-planet could also be used by slavers and sentient traffickers, and droids were often smuggled in such ways as well. Purchasers looking to obtain illegal or strictly regulated Class 4 droids, which included battle droids and assassin droids, often relied on smugglers to deliver them. Other smugglers helped transport and resell stolen goods, cultural artifacts that were desired by private collectors, or even classified information. By far the most popular forms of contraband, however, were spice and weapons. Cartels and insurgent groups of all stripes were always looking for weaponry, and they usually acquired it through smugglers. Gun running was one of the most profitable forms of smuggling, but it was also by far the most dangerous. Getting caught smuggling weapons would earn smugglers harsher sentences than almost any other type of smuggling, and in the time of the Empire, it could mean a death sentence. Nonetheless, the illegal arms trade thrived throughout all eras of galactic history, and those smugglers daring enough to get involved in it often profited greatly. Several major criminal syndicates were power players in the illegal arms trade, and many of the galaxy's gunrunners were sponsored by them. These included Black Sun, the ruling Hutt clan Gorensla, and the minor Hutt clans Barish and Vandarijar. During the time of the Republic, many kinds of blaster were freely available on the open market, so gunrunners that traded with criminal organizations primarily dealt in more niche kinds of weaponry. These ranged from weapons that faced strict regulations, such as ship-mounted quad lasers and cortosis blades, to weapons that were outright illegal, such as disruptors. Gunrunners working with insurgents generally smuggled more ordinary blaster types, but in large quantities that would arouse government suspicion or violate regulations if obtained on the open market. As with many kinds of smugglers, the rise of the Empire led to greatly increased demand for gunrunners, as the Empire cracked down on the sale and ownership of personal weapons in order to stem the flow of guns to insurgent groups. Many enterprising beings skirted these laws thanks to gunrunners, and rebel groups were reliant on sympathetic gunrunners for obvious reasons. Gunrunning became an even riskier profession than usual under the Empire, as the Imperials regularly executed anyone they caught running guns to the rebellion, but it could pay off. And then there was spice. Spice, as you likely know, was a kind of narcotic that was mined or otherwise created on several planets, among them Kessel, Ryloth, Mon Gaza, and Savarkos II. There were many different kinds of narcotic spice, all with different effects. Many were natural compounds, while others were synthetic, with one even being made from industrial dye used in starship manufacturing. As many forms of spice were addictive, spice smuggling was always profitable, and there was a whole industry built up around it. Most of the Hutt clans were involved in the spice trade, as were groups like Black Sun, the Exchange, and the Pike Syndicate, which between them employed whole armies of spice smugglers. Some forms of spice were pretty tame and pretty low risk for smugglers and cartels. Andrus, also known as white spice, was the most common of these. In its raw form, Andrus was actually used as a food additive and preservative, but when refined, it became a narcotic that gave the user a boost to their senses. Refined Andrus spice was widespread and legal even under the Empire. In fact, the Empire actually encouraged the use of refined Andrus spice, which caused some to speculate that they were trying to drug the galaxy into submission. There was also a more highly refined form of Andrus spice, however, that produced a more potent sensory boost. This variant was illegal and a popular cargo of spice smugglers. Another relatively weak spice, Rill, was also fairly popular, but much more heavily controlled. Primarily mined on Ryloth, Rill had stronger effects than Andrus, and it was incredibly addictive, causing it to be a controlled substance across much of the galaxy. Sansana spice, a favorite of the Pikes, was mined on Ventaween, and while it wasn't illegal, it was heavily taxed, due in part to its strong effects. Smugglers helped make it available for cheap, at least relative to its price on the open market. But the most sought-after spices were all highly illegal, and their effects were incredibly potent. Carcinum spice, mined on Savarkos II, was one such spice blend. It provided a boost to the user's mental and physical capabilities, as well as a sense of calm, but its withdrawal symptoms could be lethal. The highly potent Lumni spice was one of the rarest and most sought after in the galaxy, but even it paled in comparison to the most potent spice of all, Glitterstim. Mined on Kessel and derived from the webbing of the planet's native energy spiders, glitterstim induced a brief but powerful hallucinogenic high, which gave the user heightened mental abilities and a weak form of telepathy, allowing the user to read the surface thoughts and feelings of those around them. Glitterstim was extremely addictive, and constant use caused the user's nerves to atrophy, leading to blindness, paranoia, muscle spasms, anxiety, and eventually death. Glitterstim was also the basis for two other highly potent spice blends. One, known as Glitterrill, was a synthesis of glitterstim and rill produced by feeding rill to energy spiders. Glitterrill had extremely potent effects, but large doses could induce long-lasting amnesia, sometimes causing users to forget their entire lives. Another glitterstim variant, known as Tempest, produced a stronger high but severe side effects, including fits of uncontrollable rage. Most forms of spice weren't actually outright illegal, as a lot of them had legitimate medicinal uses, including rill and glitterstim. But even the legal spices were highly regulated. Some were just heavily taxed, while others could only be sold to licensed medical firms. Both the Republic and the Empire strictly scrutinized the production and distribution of spice, and both tried to prevent it from falling into the hands of drug dealers. But neither was terribly successful in those efforts, as spice smugglers made everything from Andris to glitterstim available on the black market. During the time of the Republic, spice smuggling grew into a full-fledged industry with its own hyperspace routes, dedicated shadowports, and production planets, and enormous financial backing from multiple cartels. When the Empire came to power, it came down hard on spice smuggling, not because they really cared about getting spice off the streets, mind you, but because smugglers didn't pay their spice import taxes and because the Empire wanted in on the spice game itself. The Empire wanted to control the spice trade, not kill it, and spice production actually increased during the Imperial Age as the Empire turned planets like Kessel and Sevarkos II into penal colonies. The Empire itself was actually the biggest drug dealer of the era. The Imperials covertly sold most of the spice they seized from smugglers on the black market through fronts. On paper, the severity with which Imperial law treated spice smugglers differed greatly depending on what kind of spice they were dealing in. In practice, however, the Imperial Navy despised spice jockeys, especially non-human ones, and often dealt with them as harshly as it could get away with, as drug dealers tend to treat their competitors. Even during the time of the Republic, the authorities were always one of the biggest challenges to being a smuggler. Depending on the era, smugglers had to avoid the patrols of the Republic Navy, judicial forces, or the Imperial Navy, which would all board ships suspected of being smuggling vessels and detail their crews if contraband was found aboard. During the Imperial era, spice travel was governed by a branch of the Navy known as the Imperial Space Ministry, which implemented and enforced a variety of rules that together made up the Imperial Spacefaring Regulations. Violators of these rules were severely punished, sometimes even with execution during the time of the Empire, and since smugglers ran afoul of these regulations by the nature of their jobs, this meant that they had to be good at avoiding ministry regulators and officials. But there was one regulatory body that smugglers feared even more than the Imperial Navy: the Bureau of Ships and Services. The Bureau of Ships and Services, or BOSS, was one of the oldest institutions in the galaxy, with a history stretching back 18,000 years. It started as a branch of the Republic government, but over the years, it essentially evolved into its own organization, so deeply entrenched in galactic infrastructure that not even the Empire dared to mess with it. BOSS handled most of the bureaucracy surrounding space travel. They kept records of starship registration, pilot licensing, transponder data, and weapon permits, among many other things, ensuring that everything was up to date and that regulations were followed. But BOSS also kept track of hyperspace coordinates and navigation data, and nearly the entire galaxy relied on their data for hyperspace travel. This arguably made the Bureau the most powerful organization in the galaxy. It essentially controlled hyperspace itself. Its power, massive size, and history made BOSS a very insular and tightly knit organization with its own internal customs, traditions, and even its own language. A few families had been running the bureau for aeons, which meant that Boss was both very hard to infiltrate and also had lots of secrets. This meant that getting around Boss regulations was extraordinarily difficult. Something as simple sounding as falsifying papers not only required a top-tier forger to stand up to bureau scrutiny, but also a top-tier slicer to plant the false information into Boss's meticulously curated databanks. The price of messing with the bureau was high enough that very few even considered doing such things in the first place. Spaces that ran afoul of Boss tended to lose their ships, end up in penal colonies, or worse. Governments that ran afoul of Boss fared even worse. While the Bureau traditionally remained neutral in galactic wars, on the rare occasions that it picked a side, Boss had the power to single-handedly end wars by withholding or messing with Navi computer data. Just the threat of Boss intervention ended the first Alsacan conflict, and the Bureau actually played a pivotal role in the end of the Pius Dea regime when it seeded the cult's cathedral ships with bad navigational data, stranding them in the middle of nowhere without functional hyperdrives, where their crews slowly died over several torturous decades of complete isolation. Even the Empire feared the Bureau, and for good reason. On top of the Bureau and the Ministry, smugglers also had to worry about all sorts of local threats, from sector defense forces to local pirate gangs. Sector and planetary forces posed the same risk as the Ministry or the Bureau, while many pirates would harass smugglers in the hopes of stealing their shipment. Wherever they went, smugglers had to watch their backs, and if they didn't, they could end up in some deep Sith. While pilots and fellow outlaws generally had simple and predictable ways of dealing with rival smugglers, government ministries usually had tiers for different smuggling offenses, with different punishments for each tier. During the Age of the Empire, the penalties for running afoul of the Imperial Space Ministry or the Bureau of Ships and Services were principally the 5 classes of the Imperial Penal References. The lowest class of the Imperial Penal References was Class 5 infractions, which usually weren't all that much to worry about. Smugglers would get slapped with Class 5s for things like violating local import laws or failing to comply with minor regulations, such as by not having proper emergency equipment aboard their starship. The punishment for Class 5 infractions was usually a fine, and usually not a steep one, and many smugglers found that most Imperial officials would overlook Class 5 offenses entirely in exchange for a bribe. Most smugglers worth their spice racked up a few Class 5s over the years, although it was best practice for them to avoid any infractions at all, since a record tends to draw scrutiny from officials. All the same, many smugglers, the Corellians especially, liked to claim that smugglers weren't legit until they'd gotten their first Class 4 infractions. These were handed out for minor cases of tax evasion, transporting controlled substances without the proper permits, or having expired paperwork. These were also usually punished with fines, albeit steeper ones than Class 5s typically merited, and they were also fairly easy to make vanish with a well-placed bribe. Class 3s, depending on how close to the core you were either a big deal or a slightly bigger than average nuisance. Class 3 infractions were handed out for smuggling higher value goods, which is to say most of the stuff smugglers trafficked in, as well as for attempted bribery. High fines or jail time were usually the price for Class 3, but outside of the core, a good bribe could still make one go away, assuming the original offense wasn't attempted bribery, that is. Class 2 infractions were where the trouble really started. Most serious charges against smugglers were Class 2s, and many of them covered smuggling the most highly illegal goods, especially weapons. Gun runners could draw Class 2s not only for weapon smuggling, but also for mounted weapons on their ships that they didn't have permits for. Piracy was a Class 2 offense, and during the Imperial era, rebel activity was as well. Generally, Class 2s were punished with jail time and large fines, and smugglers that drew them often lost their ships as well. During the Imperial era, smugglers that got Class 2s for pirate or rebel activity were often simply disappeared by Imperial personnel. The highest tier of infractions were Class 1s, which during the time of the Empire were capital crimes. These included things like possession of a cloaking device, attacking other spaces or Imperial personnel, or conspiracy to overthrow the government, which included serious rebel activity during the Imperial Age. Lucky smugglers that got a Class 1 just ended up in a penal colony for the rest of their lives. Unlucky ones were tracked down by bounty hunters or the military and were executed. Fortunately for smugglers, there were ways to avoid the law, and one of the most reliable was to avoid commonly used routes and spaceports. They took little used rimwood routes like the Trielis trade route or even used routes that weren't on the official charts. Smugglers had all sorts of secret hyperspace routes that they used to avoid scrutiny, among them the Lannick Spice Run, the Deathwind Corridor, the Psi Y, and the infamous Kessel Run. Secret routes helped smugglers get around blockades, reach their destinations faster, or simply avoid unwanted attention. Many of these secret routes were extremely hazardous, most notoriously the Kessel Run, which passed uncomfortably close to a cluster of black holes. A few were fairly safe, however. The scale and well-funded nature of the spice trade meant some of the most important spice smuggling routes were fast, reliable, and free of astronomical hazards. The Lannick Spice Run was the most important of these. This route ran from Mon Gaza to Spice Terminus, passing from the mid-rim out into wild space. Along the way, it passed the spice production planets Margravia, Jermak, and Mon Gaza itself, notable transshipment points at Andalasa and Medani, and spice smuggling ports on Lannick, Socorro, and finally, Spice Terminus. Even the hazardous routes were used frequently by smugglers, however, as most preferred astrogational hazards to risking arrest on the main space lanes. But while secret routes were important for smugglers, Shadowports were even more important. Shadowports were spaceports where the law was lax, corrupt, or simply non-existent, and they were vital for smuggling in the Star Wars galaxy. The exact nature of Shadowports varied. Some were mostly legitimate stops that were so busy that it was easy to slip things past customs officials, while others were properly lawless and tolerated all sorts of traffic. Some had been Shadowports from their inception, while others had originally been respectable but went seedy when legitimate trade dried up. Shadowports weren't even necessarily confined to planets. Some were space stations and a few were even mobile, allowing them to literally evade sector authorities altogether. Shadowports could be found all across the galaxy. Most of the notorious ones were in the mid and outer rims, but they could be found in the coreward regions of the galaxy as well, with a few key Shadowports located deep in the core worlds. Many Shadowports were outright lawless, or nearly so, the most infamous of which were on the outer rim. Perhaps the most well-known lawless Shadowport was Nar Shaddaa, the famed Smuggler's Moon, which orbited Nal Hutta. Nar Shaddaa had once been a legitimate port, but shifting trade routes left it behind long ago, and it had long since degenerated into a moon-sized slum, built upon itself in dozens of city layers. Nar Shaddaa was full of unregulated landing pads, and what passed for the law there was easy to bribe. What's more, most of the galaxy's major criminal outfits had a presence on Nar Shaddaa, so smugglers who had business with them often wound up on the moon for one reason or another. Lannick and Terminus, both deep in the Outer Rim, were similar to Nar Shaddaa in that they were both lawless and well populated. Lannick was regularly harassed by Imperial patrols, but Terminus lay close to the edge of the galaxy, far from authority of any sort. Even toward the core, however, there were lawless planets like this. In the Inner Rim, there was the former mining planet Corbin, which had no government and was run overtly by local criminal outfits, making it a premier shadow port. Karatos, on the Namadi Corridor, was another lawless Inner Rim shadow port, and its story was similar to Nar Shaddaa. It had once been mostly legitimate, but it was brutally occupied by Imperial forces during the Dark Times, and after the Empire left, it left a major power vacuum in its wake. Criminal groups filled this vacuum, and Karatos became a major shadow port, shipping contraband into the core worlds. There was also Bogdan, a small, grey rock located directly on the Hydian Way. a major stop for traffic of all sorts heading between the core and the rim. Bogdan and its 20 moons were all lawless and were full of unofficial landing fields and starports, making it an ideal smuggling system. However, Bogdan was one of the most unreliable shadowports in the core. It was also full of bounty hunters, thieves, and shipjackers who routinely took advantage of the spacers who landed in its lawless ports. That was one of the dangers smugglers had to contend with when using certain shadowports. Like we said earlier, pirates often attempted to steal smugglers' shipments to resell themselves. These dangers were inflated on those shadowports that weren't even on the official star charts, little habited planets that were ideal sites for secret smuggler bases. Risi, an inner rim world located in the Negs, was a prime example of this class of shadowport. Despite its proximity to the core, it was far off the beaten path, and as a result, it was a smuggler's haven, home to numerous unregulated starports. Mirkir, a forest planet in the inner rim's farthest reaches, was a similar case. It was obscure and populated almost exclusively by smugglers and other outlaws who built small starports deep in the planet's forests. Gelagar Freeport in the Outer Rim was another obscure stop, not far off the Rimmer trade route. Run by an insular and suspicious clan of Celestins, Gelagar Freeport welcomed smugglers of all types, although slave traffickers were sometimes met with scrutiny. Vergesso Prime was another big Outer Rim shadowport, and it was especially popular among spice smugglers, though it was obscure outside of the galactic underworld. Located on the Five Vales route not far from Spice Terminus, Vergesso Prime was hidden amidst an asteroid field, and it was controlled by the Tenlos Syndicate through a shell company. Nonetheless, smugglers of many types stopped there regularly, as did rebel agents during the Galactic Civil War. Some shadowports were outright hidden. Telkor Space Station, a space station in the Hapes Consortium, was one such place. It was hidden in the depths of the transitory mists, the nebulae that formed the Consortium's outer borders, and as a result, very few people even knew it existed. Port Bianco, a pirate stronghold on the colony's planet Lamax, was another hidden shadowport. Lamax was located near another nebula that made travel to the planet hazardous, and as a result, its region of space was little visited, allowing pirates and smugglers to make regular use of Port Bianco without attracting attention. Still more shadowports were legitimate ports where traffic was so intense that the law just couldn't keep up. These were some of the most valuable shadowports for smugglers, and they were especially common in the inner reaches of the galaxy. Tirahan, one of the galaxy's busiest trade worlds, was an excellent example of this kind of shadowport. An inner rim world on the Polemian trade route, Tirahan was renowned for its markets, some of which were several miles long, as well as for its bustling spaceports, which were some of the most hectic in the galaxy. Tirahan was so crowded and experienced so much traffic that its government had long ago given up on stopping crime altogether. Rather, it had focused on solely preventing violent crime, and it let things like smuggling, petty theft, and the sale of illegal goods continue more or less unchecked. Tirahan thus made an excellent shadowport, a wealthy world with access to major trade routes where smugglers could nonetheless operate with impunity. Similar cases included Byblos, a colony's world on the Corellian Run, and Katadar, another well-traveled colony's world. Katadar wasn't as busy as Tirahan or Byblos. It was principally a tourist trap, not a trade world, known for its warm seas, pristine beaches, and tropical forests, dotted with elegant cities known for their architecture, culture, and cuisine. Katadar was a paradise, but its spaceports, particularly the city of Hylota, concealed a thriving smuggling trade. Smugglers visited Katadar regularly, using it as a last stop before taking their cargoes coreward. Katadar's status as a shadowport wasn't widely known, however, and most of the tourists who came to the planet had no idea of its popularity with smugglers. One of the most popular shadowports in the Clone Wars was Abrigado Ray, which lay at the coreward end of the Rimmer trade route. Abrigado Ray was a rural world and its population was tiny for an important trade world deep in the core, but it was nonetheless very well known and its spaceports were fairly popular. These ports started off legitimate before turning seedy, and they were still safe for legitimate trade. However, they were mostly used by smugglers and other outlaws. The planet's main spaceport, simply named Abrogado Ray Spaceport, was the most important shadowport in the core worlds, though you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at it. Unlike many other shadowports, Abrogado Ray's status as a smuggler's haunt was fairly well known, though the outlaws operating in its starports still did their best to keep up appearances and make the planet's ports look legit. All told, smuggling was a dangerous and complicated profession, but one that played an important role in the daily happenings of the Star Wars universe. But what do you think? Are there other aspects of the galactic underworld that you'd like us to take a look at? Make sure you let us know in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.